Thank you. Thank you, Jen. That was a wonderful introduction. I sit here and listen sometimes to when I'm introduced, and I wonder who's being spoken about. And it becomes kind of an out-of-body experience after a while. But as far as I know, listening closely to what Jim had to say, he didn't lie any. So I guess it's me. I guess it's me. Yeah, I didn't know about this national intelligence estimate either. In fact, I didn't even know about it until I walked in the room because I didn't read today's paper because I was, at a hotel. So I'm reading this thing from the Washington Post, and my mind is spinning here. What is this? And I haven't really thought it through yet. But let me tell you what I wanted to do. Whether I'll actually do that now, I'm not certain. But let me tell you what I wanted to do. Aside, of course, from trying to sell magazines. That's really why I'm here. Here's what the current issue. This will be the current issue for another 3 or 4 days when it'll be supplanted by the next issue. This is what the current one looks like. You can find this at any Borders or any Barnes & Noble or any Hudson's at almost any airport anywhere. As Jim said, it's really a terrific magazine. I'm very proud of it. And it'll make you smarter. Whatever it is you're interested in, it'll probably make you smarter. It's highly unlikely that it'll make you dumber, I think. So what I was going to do was just sort of give you my experience sitting at my desk in Washington and talking to my old State Department colleagues and other people that I've hung around with, and try to make sense out of what has become over the last couple of years a really very strange, very loud, and very unusual conversation about Iran, insofar as American foreign policy is concerned. When I turn on my computer in the morning, I get feeds from all kinds of folks trying to funnel the news to me. Aside from actually reading the papers myself whenever I have the energy, and sometimes if I have the time, looking at the foreign press. But when I turn on the the computer and I read all this stuff from the papers and the magazines and from Slate and all the electronic, I think probably more e-ink has been spilled on Iran in the past couple of years than any other subject I can think of, including, by the way, the war in Iraq. It's just become a nonstop flow of mostly vitriol and spleen. There's been a great deal of certainty in most of this literature, and I'm not talking about what academics write primarily. I'm talking about what journalists and former government officials and sort of God knows who else writes about this subject, and it has a certain tone to it. Most of it comes across as really self-confident. But since it's all over the spectrum on a whole range of chunks and pieces of this question, it comes across as just almost surreal. There are a lot of people, Iranian exiles, former government officials, liberals, even some hawks, sort of a strange grouping of bedfellows, who are absolutely certain that if the United States military were to attack Iran over its weapons of mass destruction aspirations or former aspirations, we'll have to see what this really means that it would be the most catastrophic act of American foreign policy stupidity since the beginning of the Iraq War, and many would argue even worse than that. And they paint the picture in truly apocalyptical terms. But on the other hand, you turn the page, you push the button on the computer, and you read other people saying that if the United States doesn't preempt the advent of an Iranian nuclear capability or weapons of mass destruction capability, it would be the most catastrophic dereliction of responsibility, the most horrible thing, the most dangerous thing that any American government has done since Pearl Harbor. These are always painted in very outsized historical terms. And it dawned on me, I've tried to think through this problem out of government, and I've tried to think through it when I was in government on the policy planning staff. And what always struck me was that this is really hard. This is a really complicated, multi-dimensional problem, probably harder, sitting back thinking about it, than any contemplation that took place before March 2003 when the Iraq War began. It seems to me that this problem, those of you that, you're mostly graduate students, right? A lot of your graduate students are beyond graduate school. You took the stat packet, right? You're obligated to take the stat packet. Well, you learn in statistics. I didn't do very well in statistics, but I remember this. That there's a type 1 and type 2 errors, There's more than one way to be wrong about a problem, in other words, to speak plainly. Or as James Thurber once put it, this is my favorite way of saying this, that you might as well fall flat in your face as lean over too far backwards. Well, this is really true. And when you sit down and try to contemplate all of the ways that you could be wrong about aspects of Iran, it's very humbling, really. And the kind of uncertainty that we face, not only is it multidimensional as far as I understand it, but it's the kind of uncertainty that's structural uncertainty. It isn't like we know all the factors and how they work together, and all we lack are the numbers to put into the equations. We actually don't know all the factors. We don't know their mutual relations. It's a kind of structural uncertainty. And there are odd sort of paradoxes in it. They don't all have to do with Iran. Sometimes they're more. For example, every time the United States government in recent years has tried to conduct, either by force of arms or some other coercive means, has tried to conduct a counter-proliferation policy, whether it succeeded or failed with respect to the specific target, it generally had the effect of producing a greater incentive on for other parties, third and fourth parties, to proliferate. So even a successful act of counter-proliferation policy tends to generate contrary consequences, contrary results. It seems to me, and I can't prove this, it seems to me that the American military demonstration in the first Gulf War in 1991 probably accelerated North Korean desire to acquire weapons of mass destruction. Might also have affected the Iranian government in the same way, although we don't know this for sure. But the logic suggests that it's almost like you're damned if you do, you're damned if you don't. It's a very complicated problem, and as I say, works on several dimensions. Now, so to me, the main lesson in trying to think through it is that it's very humbling, and it's hard. And this seems to me to contrast with most of what is written about the subject, where everybody seems so darn sure that doing either this or doing that it would be catastrophic, and they know for a fact. And sometimes I get the feeling that I'd like to be as sure about anything as some of these writers seem to be about everything. So then I ask myself, well, as a social scientist, as a social science PhD trained at the University of Pennsylvania, why don't I try, anyway, to sit back and see if I can think about this in a dispassionate, professional fashion? Wouldn't that be novel, especially in Washington, where that almost never happens, in my experience? What if you took the map, and sort of erased the proper nouns and tried to erase some of the emotional baggage that goes with it? What if you stood back and sort of tried to look at this theoretically? What would you get? How would you start? What would you do? So I thought I would just sort of take you through my own sort of mental exercise, which leads me. I'll answer the questions right now before I start, and not taking into account today's news. Is the United States going to attack Iran? Okay, and when I say that, I mean, is it going to do so, say, before the end of the current administration, say within the next year or so, or even within the next 2 years? My answer is, I don't know, probably not. But the probably not is a function of, again, before this morning, what I thought the basic intelligence consensus was that this would not become an imminent threat in the next year. And that the president, if he's true to the kind of behavior he's shown on this and several other related subjects over the past 6 years, about which I have some information, his temperament suggests to him that if something is very hard and his advisors are very divided on it, that the thing to do is hedge. The thing to do is not make up your mind, not commit yourself to anything dramatic, but try to find some middle way to sort of like tweak the problem and see which direction it eventually goes. Try to buy time, in other words. That's his. When he's faced with something really hard, that's what he does. He doesn't make a decision. He just sort of backs up and says, "Let's just give it some more time." So there are other things that have been put in play in recent months, probably all inconsequential in the long run. How shall I put this? Examining the possibility, knowing that Iran, for example, is a multi-ethnic place, that very large cities in Iran like Tabriz are full of Azeris and not Persians who don't speak Farsi but speak Turkic languages, maybe some dirty tricks, maybe an attempt to see if there's any way to sort of agitate, pressure the regime from the ethnic angle, things like that, things that probably won't work or that might even be not very wise, but nevertheless would probably persuade the president, well, I'm not going to make any sort of dramatic decision to bomb the country until I see how all these other things might play out. So the answer to the first question is probably not, seems to me. And with this NIE or leaked NIE, whatever it really is, and there are a couple possibilities here, probably the pressure that he feels personally to do something before he leaves office, probably less than it was before, although I don't know for sure. I really don't. One of the reasons I don't think anybody can possibly know what the president will do is because I don't think the president knows what he'll do. When I say he's a hedger when he's faced with a difficult situation, I mean it. I don't think he knows Therefore, it strikes me as kind of logically difficult for somebody else to be sure what he'll do when he doesn't know what he'll do, unless, you know, they're like an uber psychiatrist or something, and they can anticipate his conclusions before he does. Now, the second, so that's what I think, you know, the state of play is right now. On the second part of the question in the title of the talk, should the United States bomb Iran? A different question, obviously, and I'll get to that in a couple of minutes. But the answer basically is, I don't know. And it's, as I say, it's complicated, it's hard, it's one of the most difficult decisions I can imagine any sitting president having to make. I'm really glad that I'm just quite certain I'll never have to make it myself. I'm almost completely certain that no president will ever ask me what I think about the subject. So I don't really have to say. All I know is that it's hard for me to think of any other comparable decision that would be as difficult or as portentous. I do know that my answer would be that it's not obvious that we shouldn't. All right, I could see several reasons why it would be of all the very bad things that could happen, that could be the least bad thing. There aren't any good choices; they're all bad choices. It could be less bad than several other choices, but I don't even know that. That kind of depends on how things move, how things change between now and when a moment to decide such an issue 2 years from now, 3 years from now. We don't know what things will look like in 2 or 3 years. Lately. Over the past year and a half, you know, the Iranians have been riding kind of high. We've been having a lot of trouble, largely over the war in Iraq, not to speak of Afghanistan, not to speak of other mess-ups, you know, in the government. America's reputational credibility has been weakened. The Iranians seem to be, you know, out for sport with Ahmadinejad's mouth and so forth. But this could change. I mean, the oil market could change. A new president could make a difference. Ahmadinejad might not last in his position. He's kind of a sort of a cat's paw for the mullahs, it seems to me. It's funny how fast things can shift around. And although the Iranians look like they have kind of like, you know, the motive advantage right now, that could look very different in 2 or 3 years. That's why it's very hard to say this far out from a likely, you know, decision point what anybody would do. And of course, if it gets past George Bush, and no decision is made one way or the other on this watch, which I think is probable, then everything changes. You've got different decision makers. You've got a different constellation of advisors and how they might interact, and all that stuff really matters. You also let me just stand aside here and talk a little bit about what I just read. Not that I've digested it yet, but evidently there have been these intercepts. I'm not privy to them. I'm not. I have an SCI clearance, but I haven't used it. I've had no reason to use it for a number of years. I have no idea if this is really true. Also, it's in the Washington Post. Another reason not to be sure that it's really true. I should read the New York Times, and then I'll really know what I don't really know is true. But and by the way, just parenthetically, when I was in the government, you get all this cable traffic. You turn on your computer in the morning. The computers in the government have like two buttons, basically. Those of you that have ever been in this situation know this. There's the regular, you know, unclassified part of your computer, which has all this stuff on it, like your computer does, the internet and all. And then there's the dark side. Okay, you push the classified button, and all the cable traffic comes up from reporting from all over the government, State Department, intelligence community. And if you and you can tailor what you want, and you can tell the people, the computer guys, you know, what kind of cables you want to see and what kind you don't want to see. Because if you ask for all of them, there would be about 12 hours reading every morning, and that's just not possible. So you could tailor your portfolio of what you read. But if you're a speechwriter, and you're supposed to know kind of like what the Secretary of State knows, you're supposed to read pretty broadly rather than deeply. And if I really wanted to find out what was going on in some country or some region, I could actually find out. And then having done that for a couple of years, and then go back and look at what's in the newspaper, in the American newspaper, it's like, I was reading this before and I was taking this seriously. I would say probably at least half of what you need to know to understand any situation, what's going on abroad in any capital. Less than half of it you'll find in a major American newspaper. Of the other half that you do find, half of the half is either wrong or misleading. So it changed my whole sense of what was in the newspaper and how important it was to me on a given morning. I still read it because I want to know what everybody else thinks is reality, but I don't read it the same way that I used to read it before I spent all those years reading all those cables and all that other stuff. But anyway, there are two possibilities here, it seems to me. One, there's a school of thought that says that the Iranians are just being clever and they're mounting false flag operations, and they're trying to make us think that they've stopped the programs, but in fact they haven't. Now, the intelligence guys evidently talk this through, swear it's not so, think the intercepts are that it's what it seems to be. I don't know. I do know that the CIA over a fairly long period of time on counterproliferation, proliferation, and nuclear issues has been wrong on the downside more often than it's been wrong on the upside. For example, one of the reasons for the WMD screw-up in Iraq was that they had been wrong on the wrong side in 1991 when we got in there and sort of mucked around after the first Gulf War. We found that they'd been much more advanced in their program than we thought. We also missed the Indian bomb test in 1998 in the Pakistan. We totally missed it. And you could actually go back farther. There are other mistakes on the downside that the CIA made. So the natural thing to do, it's human nature, right? It's fall flat on your face, lean over too far backwards. Never forget that Thurber remark. It's very useful. The natural thing to do is to overcompensate, all right? And that, I think, is partly what happened, not all of what happened, partly what happened with the Iraq WMD thing. And now we could be seeing it again. We could be seeing, the flop that follows the flip that followed the flop. I don't know. Another possibility, and I'll have to call some people to find out, is, sometimes in the government, in the federal government, there are, not everybody plays in the sandbox nicely together all the time. There are these intramural, internecine arguments, and they can get pretty personal. The Office of the Vice President in this administration and chunks of OSD, that is the civilians mostly in the Defense Department, had a very jaundiced view of the CIA for a number of years. And the CIA felt that it was to some extent scapegoated and it was unfairly blamed for a lot of the pre-9/11 and then the Iraq War mistakes. And so there's been the technical term for which is a pissing contest going on between the CIA and various other branches of parts of the executive branch. And sometimes this contest dribbles out, it leaks out, and we get a sense of it. For all I know, this is a volley between the CIA and OSD or the White part of the White House. This is a volley in that pissing contest. I just don't know yet, so I don't know what to make of this. So what I thought I would do, as I say, the answer to the first question is I don't know, but probably not. We're not going to bomb Iran in the next couple of months, not the next year or two. Probably not. But the more interesting question is should the United States take military action against Iran if there were an ongoing nuclear weapons program that might in fact produce a nuclear weapon? Well, here's how I think about it. Here's how I sort of try to make my way through the question. And I wrote about this, by the way, at the end of this issue of the magazine. I'm kind of assuming that no one's seen this, and therefore that if I plagiarize myself now and sort of paraphrase what I've already written, nobody would know and nobody would care. I just told you, so now you know. But if you want actually what I think in writing, all you have to do is find one of these magazines and buy it. Very simple compared to most things. It seems to me that there are sort of two broad schools of thought about the question. One is that so the Iranians get a bomb. So what? The school of thought goes, it wouldn't be a very nasty bomb. It would only be kind of a dinky little first-generation kind of bomb. There probably wouldn't be a whole hell of a lot of them either. And what's the problem? The United States deterred the Soviet Union for decades during the Cold War, deterred the Chinese for a long, long time. This is, and back in those days, deterrence rested on an idea called mutual assured destruction. Right? They clobber us, we clobber them, we all get clobbered, everybody dies. Why would anybody do a thing like that? This wouldn't be mutual assured destruction, the way that this argument runs. They're being so much weaker and so much more fragile in their strategic capabilities in the United States, we'd simply clobber them. We'd just turn them into a cloud of pink meat, and that'd be the end of it. It wouldn't be mutual assured destruction. They'd be destroyed, but we wouldn't. All right? Now, given that imbalance, why in the world would they commit suicide? Why would they attack American assets or attack the United States? So clearly, a deterrence would hold. No big problem. Why is everybody so agitated about this? But there's a different point of view, and the other point of view looks something like this. Several questions one can interrogate that point of view, I think, fairly effectively. The first is that this point of view is based on the idea that the power of the military arsenals is really the important thing. But we know from history that sometimes it's not the balance of power, but it's the balance of interest that matters most. We're far away from this part of the world. The Iranians are right there. They border Iraq, they border Afghanistan, they border Turkey. They're right there. They're going to be there forever. And so it's not always a matter of power, but it's a matter of resolve sometimes. When you're in a game of chicken or a steering contest with another side, sometimes it's the willingness to just sit there and take it for longer that matters. It isn't who's got the biggest fist. It's who has the greater stake invested in the outcome. That's one way to interrogate this question. Another way to interrogate it is this view of deterrence kind of assumes that the weapons are self-deterring by their very nature. They're so destructive, so qualitatively different from conventional ordnance that no nuclear power has ever seriously contemplated using one of these things. And people that believe this point to the record of the post-1945 period. There have been several nuclear powers. The Russians had the nukes, and we had them, and the Chinese, and the Brits, and so forth. Nobody's ever, and India and Pakistan, and no one has ever used one of these weapons in anger. And this supposedly proves the idea that these weapons are actually self-deterring and that they have no use at all, except to deter the use of somebody else's nukes, and that's the end of it. But that point of view sort of is predicated on the weapons themselves proclaiming their own meaning. And I don't think that's how deterrence really works. I think deterrence is not a static relationship. I think deterrence is a collective psychological relationship. And I think we learned the hard way that different cultures view military assets differently from other cultures. Not always incompatibly, but possibly, potentially, sometimes incompatibly. And in this article, I tell a little story that in the early years of the nuclear age, into the 1950s and 1960s, the Americans, being childs of the Enlightenment, believing in universalism, and it was a time when B.F. Skinner was very popular. For those of you who remember that name, strategic analysts thought that they were discovering absolute truths, objective truths about the character of the weapons. What, in fact, it seems to me, what we're actually doing was we were creating meaning from our own idiosyncratic cultural framework about what these things were, thinking that it was universal. So there was a man named Robert McNamara. Some of you may remember that name. He was the Secretary of Defense. He had this theory that since these weapons were, it was obvious what these things were, that he had a theory that if at a certain point we and the Soviet Union would reach an equipoise in destructive capability, the Soviets would realize, just like we did, that these weapons were not usable. Once vague equipoise was reached, we would be able to cap the nuclear competition. We would be able to create a plateau through arms control negotiations. We would be able to stabilize, to some extent, this race and calm it down. And so this was the theory. Arms control negotiations were commenced in 1960, 8, 9, I forget, back around those days, with this theory in mind. And it just didn't happen. Russian behavior did not conform to what McNamara and some of his successors and some of his colleagues thought the Soviets would do. We built, they built. We stopped building, they continued to build. They seem to have counterforce aspirations for their forces in their military writings that didn't square with the McNamara-esque idea of how these weapons would be understood. And eventually, into I guess sometime during the middle to early 70s, a point of view arose that there were different strategic cultures, that different people, different groups of people, different cultures, based on their own historical experiences and their language, saw these things differently. And so it wasn't enough that we deterred them thinking they thought exactly like us. We had to deter them thinking, understanding how they thought. Now the Russians and the Marxist-Leninists were problem enough. I mean, those of you who are old enough to have remembered all that, I mean, it wasn't exactly a fun time. The Cold War was not, fun and games. It was, it got tense sometimes. I remember October 1962 pretty well. It was not fun. But relatively speaking, we understood the Russians pretty well. They were Western. You could call Marxism-Leninism kind of a bastard child of the Enlightenment. A lot of people like that phrase. I don't know. But we understood what they were about, and they understood what we were about. The Muslim world, the Iranians, the Saudis, the Iraqis, others, this is not the same. This is different. This is really different. It's very difficult, it seems to me, for anybody to superimpose the experience of the Cold War and of Cold War deterrence onto a region that is not only culturally different from Russia, but also that is structurally different. In the Cold War, there was basically two powers that were on the upper echelon of all this, ourselves and the Russians. Nobody else was in that weight class, right? In the Middle East, if there is proliferation, there could be 3, 4, 5 powers. And the kinds of calculations that these powers might make of what is sufficiency in nuclear weapons would be very different. It seems to me that it would be less certain. What if a power had bad relations with not just one other country with nuclear weapons, but 2 or 3, maybe 4? I mean, God forbid, but who knows in 15, 20 years. How would a military staff calculate sufficiency in a case like that? Would you need enough weapons to balance off 2 of the 3 or 4? Would you need enough to balance off all of them? I mean, you could imagine all sorts of different ways to think about this. And if you can also imagine all sorts of confusions. Well, if that country now has all these nuclear weapons, maybe they're not thinking about defending or deterring all of us. Maybe they're thinking about going on the offense. And it seems to me it's arms race unstable if you have more than two powers. It seems to me it's accident stable. Stable deterrence depends on survivable second strike forces. We all remember this from the theology of arms control back when people actually cared about these things. But deterrence is not aided a great deal by mutually vulnerable second strike forces. That's an invitation to preemption. It's an invitation to accident. It's an invitation to launch on warning or launch under attack or very very hair trigger kinds of postures if you're afraid of preemption. It doesn't sound to me like a formula for stable deterrence. So there are the cultural factors, there are the structural factors. Even more than that, to interrogate the second question, and I'll sort of try to come to something of an end here. I actually don't. If the Iranians got a nuclear weapon, and even if it mousetrapped, and the Saudis managed to find some way to buy one, they could never create one. They could maybe buy one, and maybe the Egyptians who probably could produce a weapon, and maybe the Algerians and so forth. And there are a lot of Arab countries who have recently announced that they're going to start nuclear weapons programs. Not nuclear weapons programs, nuclear research programs, nuclear technology programs. And of course, they all say that nothing to do with weapons. And if you believe that, then I'm Cinderella. I mean, they're all hedging. They're all wondering and worrying. Will we really be there to protect them if it ever comes to that down the road several years? And if you're a responsible strategic thinker, you've got to think down the road several years. The lead times, given what the lead times are, that's how a responsible planner has to think. So, so the Arabs are worried. They're hedging. But even if there were 4 or 5 countries with relatively primitive first generation nuclear weapons capabilities in the Middle East, would I lose sleep over that? As far as the United States being attacked, or as far as important American allies being attacked overseas, would I lose sleep over that? Not really. I wouldn't. There's another kind of danger, though. Another way to interrogate the assumption of what I would call glib deterrence. That I think is more real world oriented than that. I tried to erase the word Iran from the map because I wanted to do this sort of antiseptic. I'll put it back now because that's silly after all. So let's assume that let's say the Iranians do get a weapon. Let's say it's not next year or the year after. Let's say it's 2011 or whatever. Just pick some year you haven't been to yet. Okay, but you hope one day to experience sometime down the road. It's not the actual use of that weapon against the United States or an ally that would worry me. What might worry me is what if the Iranians, having created this capability, then start to dick around in the neighborhood, basically, launch conventional aggression against a neighbor, and dare the United States or any coalition that the United States would organize to intervene to reverse it with expeditionary forces. What would happen then? Okay, and this takes us back, of course, to 1990, 1991 during the Kuwait War. It seems to me, anyway, that if Iraq had nuclear weapons in 1990 or 1991, all right, well, let me put it differently. Had Iraq nuclear weapons in 1990 91, would the United States have sent an expeditionary? Would the United States have led an expeditionary force to liberate Kuwait from the Iraqi army? Would it? Well, I don't know. It's a hypothetical. We'll never know. But I do know this: that the calculations would have been a lot different. To march an expeditionary force, a conventional expeditionary force, into the teeth of a nuclear shield, you would have had to have really sat and thought about whether it was worth it, or whether you wanted to do it like now, or whether you wanted to wait 6 months, a year, 18 months. Nothing endures like endures like a provisional judgment in international relations. Who knows how long that might have gone on? Even as it was at the time, the Democrats didn't want to do it, and there were no nukes. You could just imagine how the politics in this country might have swirled around. Clearly, it would have been a very different kind of calculation, and I think the same thing holds true with Iran. If Iran or any other country that is basically disinclined to the United States gets a nuke, then it seems to me it frees up that country's foreign policy for all kinds of mischief, whether it's in Lebanon or whether, for example, it's Iran occupying a part of Afghanistan near the city of Herat, maybe ostensibly defensively because of refugee flows, but that's a culturally Persian part of Afghanistan by history. Who knows? Would the United States, with the same kind of confidence, just say, that aggression will not stand, as George H.W. Bush did in 1991, and go and fix it? Would we have friends who would help us go and fix such things under such circumstances, where their cities, their European cities, would be far more likely to be in range of an Iranian attack than North America? It would affect our alliance relations, our capacity to put together security coalitions, it seems to me. Even more important, or it seems to me logically as well, what would the locals think? What would the Bahrainis think? What would the Omanis think? What would the UAE think? What would all these guys with a lot of oil think? It's too bad that we care about that, but for a while we do, and for a while we will. What would they think? Already they're looking at Iran, and nukes or no nukes, they're seeing basically an imperial pulse, and they've been there before. You know, how old is the United States? 230-some years old? I'm not good at math. But we're a young country. These guys in that part of the world remember battles that took place before Columbus sailed. All right, and this is alive in their imaginations. If superpowers are in the protection business, basically, kind of like a mafia boss. If our credibility to protect them is undermined, then they're going to smell the wind and make deals. All right, it's not a great thing for the United States if it wants to be a power in that part of the world, and that's another question, by the way. You know, that's a different level of discussion. But if the United States wants to be a great power, and it wants to have influence in the Middle East, partly because of oil, partly because of the global commons' interest in the flow of oil at reasonable prices, if that's still part of American foreign policy, which it has been for many, many decades, then an Iranian nuclear weapon, which would undermine the credibility of American promises of protection to half a dozen states in that part of the world, seems to me to be something that the United States would not be wise to allow. Now, the last piece of the interrogation. We could deter Iran. Sure we could. From a direct attack, from actually using a nuke, I think we could deter them. I don't lose sleep over that. But what if it sets off a mousetrap? What if the Egyptians decide that the Arabs have to have a bomb too, if the Persians do? And what if, I mean, if you were a strategic planner right now in Ankara, what would you be thinking? All right, I haven't talked to many Turks about this, a few, right? They're starting to get a little itchy, a little antsy. The idea of an independent Turkish nuclear force looking down the road a dozen years doesn't strike me as far-fetched at all. If they think the Iranians are going first or liable to go first, could the United States deter not one but 2 or 3 or 4 relatively small rogue nuclear forces, basically in perpetuity, from using these weapons, not necessarily against us, but against each other? Then the interrogation then runs to a different level. Does it make any difference to the United States? Is it a vital interest of the United States if there are small nuclear wars in the Middle East? If there are a couple of exchanges, you know, the Israelis and the Iranians duke it out once or twice, or the Egyptians and the Pakistan, who knows? I mean, Pakistan is another. We haven't mentioned Pakistan today. I should have. Pakistan is kind of it's a worrisome place. My friend Hussein Haqqani says the real difference between what Pakistanis talk about when they talk about their own country and what others talk about is Pakistanis say, we have a problem. And everybody else says, Pakistan is a problem. It's a small difference, but not small in significance. Small in words, but not small in significance. I could imagine a situation where the Pashtun parts of Pakistan are broken away at some point by a successful Pashtun nationalism emanating from Afghanistan. I can imagine revolts in Baluchistan getting even more serious than they already are, both in the Iranian and Pakistani parts of Baluchistan. I could imagine Pakistan essentially falling apart or becoming extremely weakened as a state. And I could imagine India and Iran competing, perhaps even violently, over the vacuum in between. And I could imagine that. I could imagine lots of other things too. But these are things that planners think through. To get back to the point, does the United States have an interest in preventing 2 or 3 small nuclear? I'm using that in quotations because no nuclear war can be small. Hundreds of thousands of people would die. By what definition is that small? It's only small compared to, for example, a U.S.-Soviet exchange during the Cold War. But is that something that we can afford not to care about in this country? I mean, are we prepared to define vital interests short of that kind of a scenario? Maybe, but I don't know any serious strategic thinker or politician who would say that that's okay. That if the Israelis and the Iranians can attack each other, and the Indians and the Iranians can attack each other over the corpse of Pakistan, and we don't care. And 3 or 4 million people die over the course of these wars, and we don't care. That seems to be impossible, all right? And so I come back to the problem of the mousetrap effect, the problem that if there are 2, 3, 4 countries with relatively primitive programs and developing a lot of fissile material, the problem of theft and diversion of that material in an age of terrorism is also not something you can just ignore, seems to me. The possibility of these states, Pakistan being a case in point, but also Iran, not really being a fully institutionalized polity, of factions within this country falling apart, arguing with one another, making deals, selling things. We have A.Q. Khan, of course, the example of A.Q. Khan in Pakistan. Who's to say that in 10 or 12 years you couldn't have a situation like that in Iran or in Turkey or elsewhere? Who's to say? So it seems to me that you want to really prevent the first one. You want to prevent the first rogue proliferation case in the Middle East. Because if you can prevent the first one, which I'm told, again, until this morning, looked like Iran as the main candidate. If you can prevent the first one, and then if you can integrate Iran into a regional security environment so that the regime is not feeling as though it's in a sense of siege and doesn't feel compelled to do these things, if you can create a different kind of a security vector, then you may be able to prevent the mousetrap effect, the second, the third, the fourth. And it seems to me that obviously everybody wants to prevent an Iranian nuclear capability by diplomatic means if possible, and I think they're quite possible. That's why I've been in favor of the what I call the effort of the three Musketeers, the EU3. I call them the three Musketeers. We've played sort of a good cop, bad cop deal with the Europeans over the last couple of years. I think it's been very salubrious for all sides. The Europeans actually got to experience the Iranians firsthand and be lied to and be insulted and be played for time. And as we say in Greek, they've been converted to halakha. They now really understand what the Iranians are all about. And by the way, I mean, I'm curious to know what the German, the BND, what the British intelligence service, what the French intelligence, what all the others think about this thing. That's going to be fun to find out too when I get back to Washington. It just seems to me, again, if we can prevent the first one, especially if we can prevent it by diplomatic means, as maybe we have, I don't know, that would be the best of all possible worlds. But it seems to me that if you sort of try your best to add up the risks of acting against the risks of not acting, you could make a case that the risks of not acting are greater. And so, in extremis, I could conceive of a policy that would involve a military strike on Iran. Now let me interrogate myself. Well, what would the cost of that kind of thing be? All right. Well, I think this is why the president is in a hedging mode. If the United States attacked Iran, anywhere, in any form, okay, the political implications would be, what's the technical term? Really bad. I mean, we would draw.
This is not officially approved Strauss Center language.
Okay, the wrath of Shia terrorism would be directed against America and American assets in a way that it never has before, and the capability of Shia terrorist organizations to hurt the United States should not be underestimated. It would not play real great on the Muslim street, broadly construed, whatever that is. It's a very vague term. The Iranians could, of course, react. They could try to close the Straits of Hormuz. They could try to do all kinds of other stuff. The Lloyd of London's insurance rates would go sky high. I personally think the U.S. Navy can send the Iranian Navy down to the chips in about 1 day. But I wouldn't want to have to do it. I know the Navy guys. I have a lot of confidence in them, but I still wouldn't want to do that if possible. You'd have to also, if you were going to go and attack Natanz and the other facilities in Iran, how many targets are we talking about? Several hundred, probably. We couldn't destroy them all. We have some earth-penetrating ordnance that we really haven't tested a lot. We don't really know if it would work. Post-attack recon would be very difficult to know what we destroyed. Very hard to do that. So you would be taking a lot of risks. And there are all these anti-aircraft missiles, a couple thousand batteries that the Russians, bless their hearts, have sold for profit. And so in order to even get to the nuclear facilities, you'd have to take out all this anti-aircraft stuff first. So you're not talking about, what my friend Eddie Lutwak once said a couple of months ago in the paper. He said, this would take 2 nights. No, it wouldn't take 2 nights. If you wanted to attack these targets, it would take more like 2 weeks. It would be a sustained air campaign. And you can imagine what might happen around the world during those 2 weeks. We probably would not have, we might have allied toleration for what we did, but vocal support, maybe Sarkozy, God bless him, would say okay, but anybody else, seems to me, they just shut up, right? I mean, they want to be, it was to be a big COI operation in Europe, a big, cover your, what, we can't say that in this room, right? it would be pretty much seen as a unilateralist American engagement. That would not be pretty. Again, we've been through. We saw that movie. That would not be pretty. There are lots of costs to doing this, and the benefits would be that you wouldn't destroy the program. You'd only delay it. You might also drive the Iranian people into the arms of the regime, the rally around the flag sort of phenomenon, quite possible. I mean, there would be lots of costs to pay in return for an attack that would not really solve the problem, but only delay the military aspect of it. That's when you put a thing like that to a president, even this president, but any president, they just kind of go, oh man, that's not good. That's not a nice, clean, crisp option that will make everybody happy. That's bad stuff. That's like problem. That's a real problem. So, then there's another possibility. Recently the government designated the Al-Quds group within Iran as a terrorist organization. Did you read about that? I'm sure you did. That struck me as a very odd thing to do. What's the definition of terrorism according to the Department of State, or according to academia? All right, terrorism. Terrorism, the way it's defined these days, is non-state actors randomly killing innocent civilians in order to create an atmosphere of fear and intimidation and so forth. How can a part of a government, and the Al-Quds group is part of the Iranian government for all practical purposes, how can part of a government be a terrorist organization when the rest of the government to which it reports is not a terrorist organization? There's a logical problem here, it seems to me. But that aside, and by the way, just again parenthetically, it's very important to be careful how you use the term terrorist. In common parlance, the way this administration speaks, but also the way the one before it spoke. For example, the attack on the Marine compound in Beirut in October of 1983 is regularly referred to as a terrorist attack, right? The attack on the USS Cole in port in Yemen in what, 1989? I mean 1990. When was that? 99, 2000? I forget. 98. Before 9/11, and I'm getting old and my memory ain't what it used to be. Is commonly referred to as a terrorist attack, right? Given the definition of terrorism I just mentioned to you, is that accurate? Is attacking uniform military on foreign soil, is that a terrorist attack? It seems to me that it's not. It seems to me that it's an act of war. It's maybe irregular war, but it's not a terrorist attack. And it's important to be very careful about how we use the word terrorism, because when we conflate and expand the use of the word terrorism, then anybody else can say, well, one man's terrorism is another man's freedom fighter, right? But that's just not true. That's not what the agreed international definition is. So if we don't keep to the definition, then we give license to others who we don't like necessarily to use the word in even worse ways than we do. So that's just a parenthetical statement. To come back to the actual talk, which is about to end, I promise. It's a real hard problem. You think about how many different prisms you could see the Iranian problem through. You could see it as a non-proliferation case, and you could see it as a piece of the so-called war on terror, whether you like that phrase or not. Pick your own clash of civilizations. You pick your own odious term for whatever it is. You could see it more broadly as a contest of sort of standard classical balance of power world politics. I mean, there are those. It's true, for example, that the Iranian-American problem is not just because of George W. Bush. Our difficulties with Iran, our different ways of seeing the world and seeing the Middle East precede George W. Bush and will succeed George W. Bush. This is a larger sort of tectonic series of large movements in that part of the world, and it's not going to end with this administration. It could be that a collision between the United States and Iran may be 20 years away, 15 years away, but the way most people in the region see it, if the Iranians really do have imperial pretensions, they want to recreate the Safavid or the Sassanid times, and we in the United States. Well, again, another parenthetical statement. I apologize. I once wrote a piece about the Balkans back in the 90s, which I called Franz Joseph Clinton. And the point that I was trying to make was this: that for hundreds of years, the Habsburg monarchy had been part of the balance of power in Europe, and that thanks to nationalism and Woodrow Wilson, the Habsburg monarchy was undone at the end of the First World War. And you could argue that a lot of the instability in Europe leading up to and including the Second World War and beyond was owed to the fact that one of the pillars of the European balance of power had been destroyed and not replaced by any other comparable power, so that there was competition over the space that the Habsburg monarchy used to control. If you think of what happened in Central Europe and Southern Central Europe in the interwar period, you can sort of make the case yourself. And so I said what the United States was really trying to do in the Balkans, we were trying to substitute for the role that the Habsburg monarchy had played for 300 or 400 years, and I wasn't quite sure that we were up to it, all right? And the jury is still out on the Balkans. But now, since the Carter Doctrine of 1977, what we're trying to do, as well as be, instead of Franz Joseph Clinton, now we're trying to be George W. Abdulhamid II Bush. We're trying to substitute for the role, essentially the role that the Ottoman Empire played a little bit farther south. That's really what the Carter Doctrine means, it seems to me, in structural terms. So you could think of the Iranian problem as part of that, rather than proliferation, rather than war on terrorism, rather than Islam and civilization. There are lots of different prisms you can see the problem through. And one of the reasons that there's never been any consensus in the government, or even outside the government, is that people, in fact, do look through different prisms. You know, the non-proliferation crowd sees Iran as that case. The war on terror, the war on terrorism, blood on the saddle types see it as part of that, and so on and so on. So that's part of the reason why in the government it's very difficult to get all the various bureaucracies and all the various points of view to settle on one way of thinking about the problem, because they all come at it from their own pet rock, so to speak. So I'll stop there. I hope that I've tried to give you, I think of this kind of as a kind of a slow motion, a yellow brick road tour to what I call the ephemeral city, where I've tried to pull back the curtain on a couple of wizards pumping away on their organs and so forth. I don't know if I've been successful or not, but we have about another 20 minutes or more, right? So we can just cut this off right now. Again, the final thing: please buy the magazine. And any questions that anybody has about this or what it's like to be a speechwriter for Colin Powell, I'll be happy to entertain you with the rest of your pizza, and after PD-59 and after Counterforce later on. But I do think that the Soviets didn't. I would never say they thought irrationally about it, but I think they did think differently about the uses of these weapons than we did, based on their own history. And I think the Chinese did too, and I think the French did too. I think every culture, every sort of language. Well, I don't even know I don't know the word for it. Sort of language group has words they use to talk about war and peace and related vocabulary, and these words, these languages are embedded in a cultural idiom that is unique to that language group. And there's a great deal of universalism, and I think obvious compatibility among these languages, but there's also areas where they don't overlap exactly. And so therefore, it seems to me that just assuming that all understandings about strategic issues are just mirror images is a mistake, and that it's worth. I point you to Nathan Light's old operational code research, which I think is still quite interesting, and research based on that and beyond that, and Glenn Snyder and the whole development of ideas that have to do with strategic culture. I'm not one of these people who believe that culture is always trump in world politics, but I do believe that culture and geography are both perduring, they're slow to change, and they matter. And if you read the article, which of course is a lot more considerate in the way that the language is used than you can possibly say in a talk, I try to make a philosophical point about deterrence. The original American conceptions of deterrence, as I very just mentioned in passing, struck me as positivist, materialist in their conceptions, whereas more sophisticated ways of thinking about it are phenomenologist or idealist. And I have always been more inclined in my philosophical inclinations to phenomenology and idealism than to Skinnerian materialism. To me, saying that a nuclear weapon tells you what it means because of what it is like a child looking at a chair and thinking that the name for the chair inheres in the object itself. That is phenomenologically extremely primitive. And I think thinking about deterrence that way is extremely primitive. Yeah.
I'd like to make a few comments or statements as either true or not true, and I'd be interested in your reaction to them. Number one, the United States foreign policy is a post-World War II, pre-Cold War kind of beast. Number two, our non-nuclear proliferation policy is a Cold War phenomenon. Number three, globalism has changed everything in terms of the spread of technology. Number four, the nuclear genie is out of his lamp and is not going back in, no matter what we do. And number 5, therefore, it's time for the United States to give up this concept of non-nuclear proliferation and deterrence, and pursue some bold new direction that nobody has thought of or talked of before.
Okay, let's see if I can remember and comment in seriatim that U.S. foreign policy is still mainly a Cold War beast, as it were. I couldn't agree with you more. I think that's absolutely true. I think, and believe me, from both outside the government and inside the government, one can get real frustrated when one contemplates that observation. And again, I write about it in this article here. In fact, I'll give you I can read about it. To me, 1992 was a great lost year of American foreign policy. 1992 was, the year after the collapse of the Soviet Union, no more Cold War, and the Bush administration had a whole year, essentially, after the Gulf War, to do a zero-based, clean slate assessment, to basically do the Walter Lippmann exercise, to bring resources into parallel, resources into proportion with interest, just to rethink these things. And it just never happened. There were some people squirreling around the bottom of the Pentagon doing their stuff, which is what they have to do. It's what the Pentagon does, to buy stuff, right? But the rest of the administration, basically, there were a bunch of speechwriters, and please understand, I have nothing against the black art of speechwriting, having been a practitioner myself. A bunch of speechwriters talking about a so-called New World Order. There was one speech, there had supposedly were going to be 3 speeches, but you know why the second and the third speech were never delivered? Because there was no there. Nobody had any ideas. People were just exhausted. They were physically exhausted. People were looking out the window, from the National Security Council building and from the State Department. People were just exhausted by the reunification of Germany and all that took in the Gulf War, and there was no reassessment in 1992. Then came the Clinton administration for 8 years, and as best I could tell, there wasn't a strategic thought in 8 years. So we really have never gone back and asked ourselves, what's different about if the Cold War was a big deal, and it was, then the end of the Cold War had to be a big deal. Why haven't we gone back and rethought all of these things? We still have not done that, so I agree with you. The best case I can think of is Korea. Before the end of the Cold War, we had something like 37,000 troops in Korea, right? We still have something like 37,000 troops in Korea. Back then, I could understand why they were there, because the situation on the Korean Peninsula was tied to a much greater and more portentous stake, and credibility in the Cold War was seamless from one crisis region to another. With the end of the Cold War, with the larger stake disappeared, what was the rationale for having 37,000 soldiers in Korea? I would ask people, and it was like they didn't understand the question. I don't get it. But the point, you're right. We have not gone back and said, all right, now let's look at this fresh. We still haven't done that, and that's too bad. That non-proliferation, the whole non-proliferation deal is essentially a Cold War issue. Is that what the second? I don't know about that. It seems to me that that's a problem that transcends any particular era. Kenneth Waltz wrote many years ago, I'm sure you all know, about the stability of a bipolar world. I don't know what he would say about the stability of a multipolar nuclear world, but I mean, his basic idea was that nuclear weapons were self-deterring, and that the more people had it, the more people had nuclear weapons, the less conventional war you'd get as a result. And I think the man, God bless him, is just wrong. I think common sense alone tells you that the more countries with nuclear weapons, this is just probability, folks, the more countries with nuclear weapons, given how the world is and given how politics is and given how political leaders are, the Napoleonic types with their hands in their pants and all that stuff, the more likely that something's going to go wrong eventually. So I'd like there to be fewer nuclear powers, not more, and I don't think that has anything to do with the Cold War. I think it's worse since the end of the Cold War, because we and the Soviets, however we differed on so many things, we agreed on that. We wanted to be the big guys on the block. The Soviet Union and the United States could agree on the non-proliferation treaty and on that deal. And we did cooperate to some extent in keeping fissile materials out of the hands of others. Now with no Soviets, and with the United States seeming to be the 800 gorilla on the block, the structure of the problem has changed, but the problem is still there, and I think it transcends Cold War. Globalization having changed everything, no, I don't think so. It's changing a lot, and it's changing a lot in ways that we don't even understand yet. But I think there's some verities of how international politics and human nature intersect that don't change, these don't change readily. So I don't know that everything is different. But I do agree that the technological genies are kind of out of the bottles, and that struggling against proliferation, WMD proliferation is kind of a harder uphill battle in the environment we're in now than it was before the end of the Cold War. And by the way, people always kind of assume that we're talking only about nukes. I'm not talking only about nukes. Chemical weapons I don't consider weapons of mass destruction, and we can talk about the technical reasons why that is. But I certainly worry about biological weapons. And I worry about biological weapons in a way more than I worry about nuclear weapons. The farther you project out the problem, the more I worry about biological stuff. Here's the reason. We know what nuclear technology looks like. We know what it takes to build these things. And the basic structure of that technology is not going to change dramatically. But bioscience is changing dramatically. We don't know the boundaries of the possible misuse of bioscience. To me, that's a much more daunting problem. Also, just in technical terms, it's small. I mean, you don't need a room this size to fabricate, do metallurgy and build warheads. The bio stuff you can do, in a closet. You don't need 800, engineers. You just need, 5 or 6 guys, with a graduate degree in molecular biology and a demonic mentality. It's real hard to deal with that. It's easier to hide. Also, from a terrorist point of view. In a way, killing a huge number of people all at once with a nuke, well, from their point of view, that's pretty cool. But actually, the terror capacity of an engineered smallpox vaccine, where it slowly moves and you can't stop it, in a way, that is even more terrorizing to a society than just a one-time calamity. So it's not just nukes. But your final point. Don't we have to do something really different? If the environment is more conducive to proliferation, if the structures that we built are not adequate to deal with the problem, don't we have to do something like rather bold and dramatically new and different? Well, my instinct tells me, yeah, you're right, but I'm not quite sure what it is. In the next issue of the magazine, not the one you have, but the one that will replace it in a bit, we've got an article on nuclear abolition. Nuclear abolition, according to this fellow, is now about to start a 4th wave. There have been 3 waves of nuclear abolition. One was right after Hiroshima and Nagasaki with the Baruch-Lilienthal plan, 1946-47. That didn't work out. Then there was another pulse of it in the early 80s with the Reagan administration when President Reagan scared the hell out of everybody, thinking he was going to start World War III. And then at the end of the Cold War, in 1994-95, a third pulse of abolition arose. And it was kind of interesting because guys like Andrew Goodpaster and Paul Nitze, of all people, Paul Nitze of NSC 68, thought that this was worth examining. And now people are saying, well, it's time to look at the 4th wave. Maybe this time we can persuade people that, the only way to stop the proliferation menace, the only way to stop ultimately a cataclysm, is to sort of reverse engineer the whole process. I had a kind of a fantasy the other day. I'm a little strange. I have these fantasies, not the kind of fantasies you're thinking about. Suppose, when Musharraf declared emergency rule, right, a couple weeks ago, I imagined that I was in a room with the leaders of Pakistan, India, China, Russia, and the United States. And the conversation went like this. You Indians, right, you are worried that these nukes, these Pakistani nukes, are going to get loose, that some unauthorized lunatic Islamic maniac is going to, drop one on New Delhi because of the Kashmir problem or something. The only way for you Indian guys, to get a grip on Pakistan's nukes is for you to reduce or put under international control or somehow go back, roll it back yourselves. And the Indians would say, well, we can't do that because Chinese are right above our borders. Then you turn to the Chinese guy and you say, the only way you can get the Indians to roll back their nukes is to roll back yours. And they would say, well, we can't do it because the Russians are up there, right? And that's why we did what we did in the 60s in the first place. And then they turned to the Russians and say, well, we can't get rid of our stuff until you get rid of your stuff. And the Russians, of course, turned to us. We started it all. We did it first and say, well, we can't get rid of ours until you get rid of yours. And so everybody just says, okay, good. Now let's have lunch. Wouldn't that be fun? There's a logic to this, though. I mean, I'm being glib, but there's a logic to this. The goal of nuclear abolition as a part, just a part of a solution to dealing with the proliferation problem is something worth thinking about again. I haven't finished my thinking on it, but there are 3 really daunting problems. One is there's the bomb in the basement problem. You can't eliminate the knowledge. So if we go down to very low levels, for example, go off alert status. We still do have missiles on alert, by the way. A former Assistant Secretary of State, Christina Roca, now has a new job at doing some sort of arms control thing. And she said the other day, accidentally, she said, we don't have any missiles on alert anymore. She was wrong. And people went, oh, my God, wow, we do have missiles on alert. But we don't need to, in my opinion. We could ratchet down basically our posture unilaterally invite the Russians and the Chinese and show them what we've done and say, we challenge you to do the same. We could push things in the other direction. So there's the bomb in the basement problem. Second problem is that to the extent that a lot of countries don't seek weapons of mass destruction, they don't do it because they trust our pledges of protection. They trust extended deterrence. If we eliminate our nukes, how are we going to substitute our pledges to those countries? So by removing our nukes, we might inadvertently stimulate proliferation on the part of countries in difficult security situations. And there are other problems as well that we have to be very careful about. But as a goal, at least as a goal of rhetorical policy, an abolition posture might be a bold thing for the next administration to do. Beyond that, it seems to me, again, I'm sorry for the extended answer, but it's an interesting question. There are only two possible stable orientations for world politics. One is the state system that we have now, what we sort of have now, the Westphalian system. The reason why it's useful for all of its frailties and for all of its fraying around the edges is because it empowers some authority to control the territory on which the state exists. If there were no gray zones or brown zones on the globe, if all sovereignties were strong enough to control their territories, you'd at least have an address for accountability and responsibility. So it seems to me that one thing you could do is to build up sovereignty and hold states responsible for what happens on their territory. The other way to go, of course, is to go completely in the other direction and create trans-state, global governmental institutions that would do that instead. The problem there is that no one's ever figured out how to ensure democratic accountability at those levels of governance. We haven't done that yet. And of course, the other way, I guess in theory, you could go backwards. You could go back to tribes and clans and so forth and have basically, anarchic, chaotic situations. But that doesn't sound very propitious, does it? Kind of like the Luddite, pre-modern. That's not possible. So it seems to me that as long as you're stuck with a system basically of states, however frayed at both edges, up and down, you're just going to have problems like this. They're never going to go away. The best you can do is manage them. I don't see how you solve them. But yeah, I think a nuclear abolition posture might be part of a bold answer to the problem. Anybody else? Last question, sir. Under Latin America, I guess you'd be y'all call you Antarctica, yeah.
Well, I have two issues. The first one is related to the structure of the presentation. Mainly, you started with the question: is the U.S. going to attack Iran? The second question you asked was: should the U.S. attack Iran? But I think a clear question that is worth to ask is that should the U.S. basing its foreign policy on the same premise that led the Nazi regime to start World War II? That is preemptive.
I'm sorry, I didn't understand the last part of this.
Should the U.S. base its foreign strategy under the premise of preemptive defense, start attacking before the U.S. is attacked? That led the Nazi regime. That was the strategy, military strategy of the Nazi regime.
Well, it's been the military strategy of lots and lots of countries throughout history. It's a very good question. The United States has had for many, many years, long before 9/11, preemptive strategies planned. During the Cold War, there were all sorts of options in the quiver, many arrows in the quiver, to preempt Soviet command and control capabilities in the midst of a crisis in Europe, things like that. So the real question is, there are two questions. One is, do extraordinary circumstances, such as those which followed 9/11, and the prospect that terrorists could get hold of weapons of mass destruction, or that states might either lose control of or give terrorists access to weapons of mass destruction, is that the kind of problem that justifies an extraordinary problem, temporary extraordinary problem, that justifies temporary extraordinary means, or is it the kind of problem that justifies a permanent change in doctrine? All right, that's the first question. Second question is, even if suppose you say that that in the past you could see a threat mounting, you could see resources being produced, you could see armies being mobilized, you could see formations of military capabilities being put together, and you had time to see this, and you had time. So the difference between a defensive war and a preemptive war, there was a real difference. Now, the way that threats can arise, that distance between what looks like defensive and what looks like preemptive has all but disappeared, it seems to me. And you could you justify not just an extraordinary response to an extraordinary problem, but a permanent doctrinal change? And then, if you do, is it smart to say it in public, say it out loud, like in the September 2002 National Strategic Guidance? My answer to the question basically is, the first question is yes. Things have changed to the point where, unfortunately, having to think about preemptive war is just necessary. But would I say it in public? Would I make it a doctrine? Would I do it without even consulting my closest allies? I don't think so. So I've parsed your question in a couple of ways. But it seems to me, and Jim and Ivo, co-author, talk about this question in one of the early issues of the magazine, second or third issue. Talk about it, I think, very intelligently, and it's at some length. And if you come up to me afterwards and give me your card, I'll send you or you can just ask. I guess you could ask the faculty to send you. When you see it in print, you can take your time with it and think it through. It's a real serious problem. There's just no gap anymore between between threats mounting and threats being imminent. It's very hard. That distance has changed because of technology. It's a real problem.
Okay, at this point, I want to ask everyone here to join me in thanking Adam Garfinkle for, I think everyone agrees, wide-ranging forms of art. Let me remind everybody once again, The American Interest. It's available on book stands. There's also a website, the-American-Interest.com. You can get a subscription. So take a picture of that. And in the interest of hawking your stuff, again, this is the Robert F. Strauss Center.
Very important.
Come see about us at www.robertstrausscenter.org. For those of you who are students and have exams next week, good luck. For those of you professors who have to grade them, Godspeed. Everybody have a great end of the semester.